Hello, I'm Benjamin Limmer, Bureau Chief for Public Transportation at the Connecticut Department of Transportation, and I'd like to welcome you to Along the Lines, a podcast series where we'll share exciting news and updates and explore current issues and ideas on Connecticut's public transportation system. The topic of social equity is a cornerstone for the Connecticut Department of Transportation. Social equity ensures that everyone can fully participate in society, thrive, and achieve their utmost potential. In countless communities across our state, as well as the nation, the legacy of exclusionary practices continues to pose challenges. Our mission in planning for equity is very clear: to foster vibrant communities with cleaner environments, more affordable housing, ample open spaces, enhanced educational opportunities, and of course, more reliable, accessible public transportation. Today, joining us as we explore how these principles shape our communities and pave the way for a more inclusive and sustainable future, we have an honored guest, Taiwo Jaiyeoba, who is currently the National Director of Bus Rapid Transit Planning with Lochner Engineering based in Chicago. Taiwo is also a former city manager in a couple of communities in North Carolina, as well as a former planning director in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Taiwo has a deep background in not only urban planning, but public transportation as well. Taiwo and I do go back to my own days in North Carolina, so I'm excited to talk with him about this very important topic. So, welcome to the program, Taiwo.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me on the program.
So, Taiwo, jumping right into it, some people may be asking why governments and community partners are putting so much effort into equity. Can you explain to our listeners why we should?
Again, that's a really good question. It's so important in what we do, especially in local government, because municipalities, as you know, are implementers of community aspirations. So when community has something they want to do, they either go to their mayor or go to their elected officials. And so partnering with residents, with advocacy groups locally is critical to achieving equity, because then you bring different voices to the table in the process. So that's the first thing. Municipalities are implementers of communities' aspirations. Secondly, is because of proximity of local government to residents. Local governments are the most reachable in the governance structure of our nation. Nobody calls the United States president or the governor when they need their potholes to be fixed or their trash can to be picked up, or if the bus shelter doesn't look good. They talk to their elected officials because they're closer to the ground. And so it's very important that we partner together with the community, because that's really where the work gets done on the ground. Local government, I believe, that's exactly where the work is done. That's exactly where the budget is put together to actually meet some of these needs. So it's so important that we partner with individuals, with organizations, with schools, with communities that are advocating for more transit, especially on the ground.
Taiwo, you and I have talked about this. A huge inspiration for this particular episode was a particular project that's going on in Connecticut called the Greater Hartford
Mm-hmm.
Mobility Study. And it's actually the topic of next month's podcast, where we will be talking all about that project. And really, that will address some of the project is going to address some of the past sins during previous economic development plans and the construction of the interstate highway system throughout central Connecticut. So, just setting the scene for that upcoming podcast, can you talk about the harm the interstate highway system has done to vulnerable communities throughout the country?
Ben, thank you very much for referencing that project. That's a project that I have also been following from the distance because of its focus on mobility, but also addressing the inequities created by um, the highway system all over the country, not just in Connecticut. Whether you're talking Sacramento, it's Highway 99 that divides the community in Sacramento, or maybe even Highway 5 going north to south. Columbus, Ohio, it's Highway 65. In Charlotte, North Carolina, is Highway 77. In Memphis, is Highway 40. And the Greater Hartford Mobility Study is talking about Highway 84 and 91 in Connecticut, dividing west and east and north and south. So all over the country, we have this, and it has separated minority communities that are largely low income and underserved. It has divided them from accessing essential services. And so it's created poor air quality in many areas, poor quality of life, health issues for many communities. Here in Greensboro, Business 85 pretty much divided the local, mostly predominantly Black communities from accessing other services, and they have largely industrial uses that bring trucks into their communities. And so the Greater Hartford Mobility Study, his approach in trying to bridge that divide is definitely commendable. But the same thing should be done nationally, where the highway system was meant to move traffic efficiently through the country, but in the process has actually created division between underserved communities and the services that they need, and especially making it impossible for them to have the type of development that other parts of the community has. And so as we begin to bridge some of those, either by using transit, public transit, or by using pedestrian accessibility or some form of mobility, that brings people closer to services. In some instances, some of these freeways, for example, in Columbus, have been totally eliminated. They've been lowered so that people will be able to actually cross, bridge these barriers. So I think it's the right thing to do. It's one tool to addressing the issue of social inequity in our communities.
Speaking of equity, you're a planner by background, as am I. What do town planners need to consider for equity in urban planning?
So I need to first of all tell the audience that when I first met Ben, I knew there was a reason I liked the guy. I mean, planners, when you spot another planner, right? And as we talk about things over the years, our friendship evolved, but we also have a lot of professional topics that are of common interest that we discuss quite a lot. And one of those really is equity in urban planning. Now, because like me, Ben has also gone to many states, many communities across the country. We were in Atlanta together. We were also in Charlotte together. And, one thing that quickly hits us when we have this conversation is that in order for us to consider equity in urban planning, it starts with policy. Once the policies are reshaped, redefined, then you have a foundation within upon which to build, addressing the gaps in equity. The mistakes a lot of communities make is to start with the zoning regulations. The regulation, red line and all of those things, that definitely needs to be eliminated. However, though, it has to start with the policy because that's where you get to have the input of the community. That's what we did in Charlotte. We rewrote the comprehensive plan and made sure that social justice and equity was a major part of that comprehensive plan. There were a lot of people who criticized it, that it wasn't a land use plan. It was meant to be a land use plan, but it had now become a social justice plan. But I believe that you cannot separate land use planning from social justice. You've got to be able to encourage the people to participate in the process who had not had voices at the table. So once you rewrite the policy, then you can also begin to rewrite the land use regulations in order to be able to overcome some of the legacies of red line that we see and urban renewals that we still have with us today. So again, it starts with policy and then it flows into the regulations. And until communities actually redefine and rewrite those tools, it will be very difficult to achieve equity.
Coming back to Connecticut, I think you might have some connections to our great state.
Yes, I do.
I'm excited to talk about two upcoming projects that will help equity both in public transportation as well as urban planning. We have two very active TOD projects at our two busiest commuter rail stations, one in New Haven and another in Stamford. Both of these stations are undergoing complete renovations. They both are very active multimodal transit centers with bus connections as well as other forms of mobility connecting to these stations. But they, most importantly, have significant economic development potential and currently are soliciting for developments next to these two stations. I wanted to get your take on what it takes to have a successful TOD development, especially ones of such large scale. I believe you've worked on some, I know in Charlotte, but as well as in other communities. Or even specifically, what do you know about New Haven and Stanford and what the potential is there?
Yeah, that's great. There's a reason I follow the Yukon Huskies. As you know, my father lived in Connecticut for many years when he was in Storos. And I grew up in Nigeria, but visited Connecticut many times. Storos, New Haven, Stamford, Hartford, places that my father would take us. And he did not drive. And so we relied on public transit. He was a student he's a PhD student. And so we relied on transit to get us to where we needed to go, even when we went to New Jersey and Newark, especially. When I was in Sacramento, I led the transit oriented development program for the Sacramento area transit district. And the concept of equitable TOD, transit oriented development, was not even in play at that time. But we all knew that whenever you have a transit oriented development around transit stations, it's not supposed to just be driven by developers or even the public entities. If you want to make it equitable and in terms of use, it has to start with defining it and designing it with the community of riders and those who live close enough within proximity of the stations. So there are people who don't live within the area who will not do business there, but they just ride through. So riders have to be involved in the process. I felt that most TODs fail not because they are not good projects or not because they are not valuable projects, but because they're not inclusive enough in terms of those who will be using and accessing the facilities around these stations. The question about equitable TOD for me has always been what's equitable about transit oriented development if it results in displacement? And so you've got to make sure that you involve everyone at the table. In other words, include barber shops there rather than displace them, include salons there, places where minorities and underserved communities will go to do business. They should be part and parcel of the whole transit oriented development uh, program. It should also not be transit adjacent development because it's possible for development to be next to transit, but they're not necessarily oriented towards transit stations. They should be oriented towards transit stations so that people can access them and people can really find the value to using them. But again, to define that equitable piece, you've got to involve the people who are going to ride there, ride through it, and also live within a quarter to half mile radius of that particular station. So hopefully, as you develop these stations in New Haven and Stamford, two cities that I know very well, I think it's very important to include the people who ride to it, who ride through it, and who live within half mile to a mile radius of the stations.
No, perfect. I want to piggyback on something you said, and it was accessing the station itself. So in Stanford, there is an option to include not only the TOD itself, whatever the potential use of that particular development might be, but to incorporate a new station as part of the overall development. And I know that you were involved in the Charlotte Transportation Center, which had similar goals, but do you have any thoughts or guidance on how to incorporate an active transit facility into a private TOD project?
It depends on what type of mode of transit that we're even talking about. If it's just rail, then it's very important that safety becomes part of the consideration. As people, do better if they don't have to cross, to get to the investments. If it's a multimodal nature, whether it's rail, bus, rapid transit, or buses even coming together in one area, that seamless integration between the different modes and the development will be very important to access. And then all of this, it should not be too complicated for people to get to a coffee shop at a transit station. It should not be complicated for people to access uses, whether people who rely on accessible services such as our disabled riders. It should not be complicated for them. The reason why TOD, transit oriented development, should succeed is when you have front doors facing where people get off of the stations, where people transfer. Transfer by themselves are complex. And making sure that they are seamless in such a way that people are not only able to transfer between modes, but they are also able to connect the uses around those stations. That was taken into consideration on the Blue Line in Charlotte. It was taken into consideration on the Blue Line also, of course, in Sacramento. And so it's very important that access has to be front facing, has to be seamless, has to be integrated, that pedestrians and people who depend on transit, especially our disabled riders and residents, have to be safe, but also be able to get to where they need to go without us creating barriers, through our TOD design.
Hey, also equity in public transit is a topic that we have focused on in previous episode of this podcast. Uh, can, t- can you tell us why it is so vital to ensure equity in service planning and our future public transportation investments?
I believe it's very important because you have to design services to get people to where they need to go. We have a lot of focus on ridership, and that's really good. But I think there should be a lot of focus on getting people to where they need to go, whether it's healthcare services or whether it's somebody visiting their parents in a senior facilities or going to school or getting to work. And that's why I believe even when we're doing service planning for our transit services, how are people able to access those services, but also how do they get to where they really need to go, preferably if they do not have to do multiple transfers. Equity is very important in how we design those services to minimize transfers and to make life easier for those who depend on it. That is a lifestyle or lifeline for them.
Finally, what more do you think Connecticut or our country as a whole should do regarding social equity in public transportation?
There's something I've been thinking about for a while, and I call it fair fares, FAIRFARE. I'm not talking about elimination of fares. I'm thinking more about making fares equitable, making it fair, because equity is really about fairness and justice. I've thought about that a lot. That's one. Number two, I've also thought about investment in infrastructure that support mobility, such as sidewalks and all of those things, and making sure that we also provide shelters rather than stops. I think those are important regardless of the weather that you live in. I think when we think about the people who need transit, when we provide and meet their needs, then we're also going to be able to meet the needs of those who use it as a choice. And so, in order for us to achieve social equity, all of those things are critical.
I would like to thank our special guest, Taiwo Jaiyeoba, for engaging us in such an insightful conversation today on this absolutely very important topic. Taiwo, looking forward to your role as National Director of Bus Rapid Transit for Lochner. If you would like to see the number one ranked bus rapid transit system in our great country, come visit the CT Fast Track system located in Hartford, which has been open for almost a decade. And we are actively planning on a second bus rapid transit line in New Haven. So next time you are in New England, please stop by and visit.
Absolutely.
The Connecticut DOT is committed to improving equity in our public transportation system across the state. It is absolutely vital to review all planning studies through an equity lens. It is also important to note that planning for equity does not stifle growth, but rather expands opportunities to all members of our communities throughout our state, especially in those communities that were excluded in the past. I'm Ben Limmer. Join us next time for another episode of Along the Lines. Thanks for listening to this episode of Along the Lines. This is your host, Benjamin Limmer. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe and share.